Alright y'all, we're back trying to figure out the CNC. I decided I just needed to do a ton of different projects really fast to speed up the learning curve. Since it is nearing Halloween season, I decided to just cut out a bunch of Halloween shapes. Luckily, easel comes with a library of designs that you can choose from. I chose my 6 favorite designs and started cutting them out from the shortest period of time to the longest. In my last CNC video, I cut out my channel name, but I didn't cut all the way through because I didn't know how to make tabs. So this time, I decided to add tabs to the project so that they wouldn't fall out. I'm going to be cutting everything out of 1/4 inch plywood or MDF, and then use a flush trim bit on a router to trace those shapes and cut them out on thicker material. I chose to do this to see if it would be faster and also so that I could get some practice using my bandsaw and router table. I ended up having to use some pin nails to hold the piece I was cutting in place. The first shape I cut out was a bat. The first lesson I learned during this project is to make sure that the project is far enough away from the top edge that the cutting sled doesn't tip. As you can see here, I had to put a little bit of pressure on the bottom of the sled to keep it flat. You can see where the router cut the wrong area because it was tipped up. I moved the bat down in the G-code file and cut it out again. This is when I realized that the bat was lopsided. I took off the cut piece and ran the CNC through the calibration process a few times before trying the bat for a third time. I'm happy to say that it was a success and that the bat came out perfectly symmetrical. Here are the two bats side by side so you can have a better idea how off they were. The last shape I cut out on the first day was a big pumpkin. This cut went awesome as well. Because I added the tabs to the piece, I have to cut them out using the oscillating multi-tool. Next it was time to try to move on to cutting out the shapes with the bandsaw and router table. I have not used a router table in over a decade, so I definitely had some relearning to do. The first thing I tried to do was to cut off the tabs using a bottom bearing flush trim bit. Next, I traced my shape on a really bowed piece of plywood and cut it out on the bandsaw. Now it was time to attach the guide I cut out on the CNC. Routing this with the warping was nearly impossible, and it was made much more difficult by the fact that I cut way outside of my traced line, over 1/2 inch outside in some places. After many struggles and cuts where they weren't supposed to be, I turned off the machines and called it a night. The following day I started cutting out shapes again. I started with the pumpkin and it went perfect. I ran the CNC with the Z-axis disconnected so that it couldn't cut out the shape. I did this to make sure that it wouldn't go outside the area I had available to cut. Then I started cutting out the ghost. Unfortunately, my router bit broke and it ruined the cut. I think the bit was chucked in too deep to the router and that's what caused it to break. I put in a different router bit and started my cut again. It didn't even make it all the way around before something went wrong again. I thought I broke another bit, but actually the bit just completely fell out and drilled its way through the workpiece and 2 waste boards behind it. After making sure the router bit was as tight as it could be, I ran it again and successfully cut out the ghost. And now to cut out even more ghosts. Because this board that I'm using is old and warped, it has actually some sheeting for a BMX ramp that I had back in the day. So it was not very good material. It was kind of bowed and warped, so some pieces were getting cut all the way through and some pieces were not. So I adjusted the depth a few times and had to run the cut several times to get the ghosts cut out, but I eventually got them cut out and it turned out pretty well. After the ghosts were done, I did cut out a 6th shape, but because things had gone so wrong, the GoPro died and ran out of battery, so I'll show you that shape in the next step. And the next step in the process is sanding. Started out using the belt and disc sander. And after sanding everything I could with the belt and disc sander, I moved over to the oscillating spindle sander to get all those inside nooks and crannies. And this shape here is the one that I didn't show me cutting out on the CNC. It is a zombie hand coming out of the ground. And it was by far the hardest one to work with from here on out, just because it was so many little tiny fingers and pieces. I even had to switch to a smaller bit on the oscillating spindle sander. Next, I hit all the flat edges with a random orbit sander. I then went through my scrap plywood and found a piece for each one of my templates to cut out and trace for my final product. Then it was time to trace out my shapes and pull out my bandsaw and get it set up. I'm loving my little bandsaw cart I made. Then I cut them out and I made sure I got really close to the line this time so that my router table wouldn't have to do as much work. It is very tedious to cut out on the bandsaw. And after doing everything, I don't think that it was faster to do it this way. I think it would be faster to just cut everything out with out of 3/4 inch plywood on the CNC. Now it's time to move on to routing out the pieces on the router table. This time I used a top bearing flush trim bit instead of a bottom bearing, and it was also very helpful that the piece was perfectly flat. That made things a lot easier. And this turned out really, really well. I'm really glad that it turned out well. Next, I repeated the same steps on the other ghosts. Because these ghosts had eyes and a mouth, I used my drill press to drill out holes in those areas and then went over to my scroll saw and cut them out the rest of the way. Because my bandsaw was so small, I couldn't cut out these big pieces on one side, so I would have to flip them over and trace them out on the other side so I could flip them back and forth to trace the line on either side. I used double stick tape that I got sent to me by a company, and I will link their Amazon thing in my Amazon storefront if you want to check out the double stick tape I used. It worked pretty well. I just cut everything out and glued it down, and for the really big pieces, some of them I had to put some screws in to hold it in place, but that worked out pretty well. And I got everything cut out. The hand was the only shape that I used 1/2 inch plywood for. Everything else I used 3/4 inch plywood. Because of this, I had to use a different flush trim bit because the other one couldn't go low enough. So I did that and got it traced around, and it turned out pretty good. After getting all the pieces cut out, I went back and rounded over all the edges with a 1/4 inch roundover bit. And after a final sanding, they were all done and ready for paint. I just used some random cans of paint I had laying around. But if you do this and you want them to go outside, you should probably use some exterior paint and maybe seal them afterwards. But I just used whatever paint I had on hand because I didn't really want to buy some more. But this will work. And here they are all completed. It took a lot longer than I thought it would, but they all turned out really well. I'm actually really happy how they turned out. And I learned a lot on this project, and it is going to make my future projects that much easier. Alright, that's a wrap on this build. They turned out really well. I'm glad they turned out the way they turned out. I will, in the future, probably just cut out the 3/4 plywood with the CNC instead of doing the whole flush trim method. I thought that would be faster, but it's actually probably way slower. So, just gonna be cutting them out with the whole thing next time. So, have my next projects already lined up, and I'm about to start working on them as soon as I finish this video. So thanks for watching. Bye!